evening. Thank you for coming to this session. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speaker and the organizing student group to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. In the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's event. Our guest speakers are joining us on the stage here. On behalf of President DeGioia, the President of Georgetown University, the Dean of the School of Foreign Service, Joel Hallman, the Director of the Center for Security Studies, Bruce Hoffman, we'd like to welcome everyone here. I'm going to turn this over to Professor Chris Taylor, who's going to moderate tonight. And I'd just like to say that Chris Taylor and Matt Zase have started the first course of Hacking for Defense here at Georgetown. 20 of our students are here in the audience tonight, and this innovative program started out at Stanford and for the first time conducted here in the DC area at Georgetown is a program that we think is going to really pay big dividends, not only for our students, which is the #1 priority, but also for the military and corporate sponsors that have been so heavily involved in the course this year. And we're grateful to the military organizations that have provided their problems and to the corporate sponsors who have provided mentors. And so we're very grateful to have all of you here so we could spend the next 90 minutes talking about defense innovation. And so with that, I will turn this over to Chris Taylor. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening. Welcome to Georgetown University, established in 1789. It is America's largest Jesuit and Catholic university, and you are sitting in Gaston Hall, which was first built in 1901, completed in 1901. A pretty sharp venue for us to be talking about innovation and national security this evening. Thanks to Dave Maxwell, who's the Deputy Director of the Security Studies program, who has been nothing but supportive of all of the efforts. Normally on Monday evenings, our students put your hand, H4D students, if you put your hands in the air, and our mentors, and our corporate partners and everybody, we're across campus at St. Mary's Hall in room 110, but we decided to do this instead this evening. and we're very happy that you all could join us tonight. So you all have programs. I'll just introduce by name everybody here on the panel so that you can get the names straight. On the far end is my good friend Erin Simpson, who's the CEO of Archer Avenue Consulting and previously taught Marine Corps Command and Staff College. To her right is Mr. Andrew Hallman, who's CIA Deputy Director for Digital Innovation. To his right is Mr. Milo Medin, who is the VP for Access Services at Google and also a member of the Defense Innovation Board, which has their quarterly public meeting tomorrow morning. So hopefully a lot of what we talk about today will help inform part of that meeting tomorrow morning. To his right is General Paul Selva, the 10th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we're grateful that he can make time in his busy schedule to be here. And then to my immediate left is Ms. Soraya Correa, who is the Chief Procurement Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm Chris Taylor, sitting in for Matt Zase, who is my co-instructor in Hacking for Defense. Matt is a lieutenant colonel, active duty lieutenant colonel, and deputy director of the Strategic Initiatives Group at U.S. Army Cyber Command. So Matt, thanks. You really should be the one up here, quite frankly. Okay, so let's get started. We don't want to waste any of our time. I want to start the first question. I'm going to pose it to the audience. By a show of hands, how many of you are confident right now that you could stand up in front of your fellow men and women, innovators, and give a succinct definition of what innovation is and why we do it in the context of national security? That's two. So it's a good thing we're having this panel, I suppose. So let me pose the same question to the panel. What really is innovation in the context of national and homeland security? There are any number of definitions out there. Are we actually innovating? Are we improving? Are we inventing? What is it that we're actually doing? And more importantly, why are we innovating? General Selva, I'll start with you.
Interesting question. So invention, innovation, or reinvention? Three ways I try to describe it. Innovation is about fundamental change in the way we do what we do. Invention and reinvention are about simply improving what we do. And I think we need a balance of both in the national defense part of national security. We have to be conscious of the fact that what we do is inflict unspeakable violence on a potential enemy. That's a place where invention and reinvention actually make a difference. But the knowledge we bring to that fight, the things we can know about that potential competitor, about that adversary, are a place where innovation really has promise. And it's about how we deal with the mountains of data that surround us every day about potential opponents and how we make sense of that data and use that data for advantage in time and space in that battle, on that battlefield. And so that, I know that's not a very good definition because there's way too many variables in it, but I think those are the kinds of places that we go inside the national defense enterprise when we think about innovation and invention.
Well, I think it's a fair definition given that there are lots of variables in the problems we're trying to solve as well, sir. Milo, let me contrast what General Selva just said with the private sector, and particularly Google, and your thoughts on innovation and what it actually means, contrasted with the national security mission first, and then in the context of national security.
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually agree with General Selva in terms of definition. I would use a different semantics. So, for example, Barnes & Noble, as a bookstore, innovates. Point of sale systems, inventory control, driving more efficiency, et cetera. Amazon uses innovation strategically to completely change the process. And so there are both processes have a different, or both of them are useful in different contexts. But I think when we typically talk about innovation in the strategic context. How do we change the way we do things? How do we gain advantage by not playing the same game that has been played before? And the U.S. has had a history of being able to do that well. things that change the game, precision-guided munitions, stealth. And the question is really, are we going to be able to continue those kind of innovations going forward that change the game, that make the enemy play with a forced to engage with a different set of rules?
So, Andrew, you know, you're from the CIA, and the intelligence community is different from the intelligence community is different from the national defense part of innovation. You're the deputy director for digital innovation at CIA. How, as you hear General Selva and Milo talk about how they feel in a classified, although many of these programs are classified as well, but in a more classified program where you don't like to talk about anything that you're ever doing, how do you manage innovation, what's going on in the world versus what you're managing inside the agency itself?
So I'll first say that playing off both Milo and General Selva's definitions, I think of improvement as a incremental change. I think of, you could argue whether invention or innovation is a strategic leap, but I think of innovation as similar to what Milo said of as, maybe it's the way we change the way the ecosystem of capability works. The invention is subparts of that ecosystem, but the innovation is how we put those pieces together to strategically change the game. For CIA, how we think about it is, one, the reason we do it, as General Selva acknowledged, is our adversaries are conducting this in their space and oftentimes with fewer restrictions than we have. And we have to be able to embrace whole-of-nation approaches in the commercial sector, the private industry, startups, innovation hubs, to dominate our adversaries in that space. And so for us, as equally insular as any other defense establishment, it's how do we drive that close embrace of private industry, use the very abundant commercial analogs, Google, Apple, elsewhere, and apply them in a national security context to dominate our adversaries. That's why we do what we do.
So, Erin, we now have a base understanding of what innovation is in the context of national security. You've been the CEO of a company that has worked in the national security ecosystem for a while. It was very successful.
Thank you.
It was great. From a vendor perspective, from an industry perspective, do you see what General Selva and Milo and Andrew are talking about from outside? Do you see that inside?
I think you can only see it from outside. I think it's really hard to see from inside. I ran a company called Karis Associates with David Kilcullen, and we did a lot of work for DARPA and other research and development work in the defense kind of wider defense enterprise. And I used to make a joke. I was really into statistical forecasting and various kinds of predictive analytics, and that if we created a perfect crystal ball that could 100% work on, which revolutions were going to overthrow governments and which groups are going to become insurgencies, that the last people to buy it would be DIA. Because it would put them out of business, right? And so innovation requires organizational change, and it's really hard to expect people to procure in a way that's going to just completely break every rice bowl they've ever put a chopstick in.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I've always said that innovation is the idea part, right? It's the selling of the thing that seems to be the hardest thing that we can do between the private sector and government. Soraya, from your perspective in the Department of Homeland Security, where does innovation come from? From whence does it emerge?
It emerges from all of us. And I'm looking at this from the procurement angle, but I certainly work with the Science and Technology Directorate, the Customs and Border Protection. I work with all the elements of the Department of Homeland Security. And I believe that innovation is about ideas. It's about coming up with ways to use what we already have as well as use the new things that are coming in and coming up with creative ways on how we bring these things together. And when I look at the world from a procurement standpoint and I think about innovation, it's about finding more creative, more appropriate ways or more simpler, faster ways of bringing these technologies in to enable the operators to use innovation. So,
Do you find that is there an enthusiasm inside DHS that allows, and is there a mechanism that allows even the most junior people to present their ideas and
Yes.
have them possibly adopted?
well, I'm not going to pretend that the entire culture is embracing, but we are talking about innovation on a very regular basis, whether it's in procurement, whether it's in science and technology, whether it's down at the component level. We're constantly talking about how do we improve? How do we protect the homeland? What are the technologies out there that we can bring in to enable us to do our mission much better? Because we do have to stay ahead of the threat that's out there. So everyone is talking about innovation, and we're trying to find ways to inculcate that into our culture. From a procurement standpoint, I stood up a procurement innovation lab to focus on how do we buy more effectively, more efficiently? How do we partner with the technical folks in the organization, whether it's IT, whether it's the guys that are buying aircraft or boats, to come up with ways to be more efficient and effective in our buying, because we got to deliver much faster, and we got to deliver smart ideas, and we got to engage with industry early, often, and make sure that industry understands the problems that we're trying to solve.
Can I challenge you on something? Not on your comment, but on the way you asked your question.
Of course, sir. You're the vice chairman. You can
Well, be
challenge.
it to me to challenge the faculty. But you said something I think is really important, and that is that innovation is about the idea, if I heard you correctly. And I'm deaf as a post, so I may not have heard you correctly. But if innovation is about ideas, we will never get there. I think innovation is about ideas that answer a problem that scales into the culture of the organization. And I think those are really important variables. Just having an idea is not good enough. You have to have a process by which you can operationalize that idea, and the process must scale to whatever the size of the organization is. To the Barnes & Noble and Amazon example, right? If Amazon had just had the good idea, they'd be Barnes & Noble. They scaled it in a different way. They had a culture that said, we can do this. It's about delivering all sorts of things to consumers, not just books. And it's not about point of sale, it's about efficiency of distribution. And so those things scale in a way that make that idea into reality. And I think one of the dangers in our culture that craves innovation, it's ideas for ideas' sake. And I think we have to be careful about that, particularly in the national defense and homeland security space. It's not enough to just have a bright idea. You actually have to be able to operationalize.
Well, would that it were. I mean,
So what's that? Go ahead, Erin.
would that ideas were enough? I mean, how many good idea fairies do you even just have in this room? I mean, I think we'd all, have a better way of doing things. But scale is one part, but there's also a part of organizational breakage that also comes with pure innovation, right? Even just in the military realm historically, if you look at the history of carrier aviation or blitzkrieg, right? The problem wasn't that France didn't have planes and tanks and radios in 1939, right? But they didn't have an operational concept that put them together. The Navy spent most of the 1930s testing the concept of carrier aviation and didn't even really believe it until the battleships all got blown up at Pearl Harbor and they didn't have a lot else to work with, right? So the scale piece is important, but ideas that scale also don't just generate overnight. There's an infrastructure that tests and embeds and develops that over time.
Yeah, I would just add, I think part of the challenge with strategic innovation is it's hard to do that when you're dominant. You're Barnes & Noble, you have all those stores, you're telling me you want me to not use any of that? You're telling me all my infrastructure, I don't need that anymore? This is the reason why oftentimes disruptive innovation comes from the outside, because someone who has no market share to protect, who wants to enter the space and generate a capability untied from the day-to-day operational work, right, that an incumbent may have. It's a different animal. It's almost easier because they don't have to. On the one hand, they don't have that distribution, they don't have brand, et cetera. On the other hand, they're not saddled with all of that infrastructure that you have to justify. And so that's a real challenge, I think, in this context for the government as a whole. And it's one of the things that restricts the kind of space that you survey, right? If I don't have an Air Force, well, maybe I'm not going to build airplanes. I'm just going to use
Or manned
UAVs,
airplanes.
right? So there's a whole set of things that you look at when you don't have capability, and I'm going to use technology to generate that capability in a different way than the leaders do. By the way, I have to also say, I have to give you the usual prologue, which is my comments are only my own, and I don't speak for the Defense Innovation Board. I do not speak for the Department of Defense. So I've checked the box.
He didn't say Google, so I'm assuming that it's okay.
Sometimes I speak for Google.
So, General Selva, I think I may have cut off my own question. I don't make the case that innovation is only about ideas. I make the case that it is about ideas, but they have to be, my experience at least, is that it has to be problem-centric. We can't just invent or innovate tech for tech's sake. Just because something cool doesn't mean it solves a problem. If we don't start every activity with the problem, we're not going to get anywhere where we need to be. Andrew, you wanted to?
Yeah, because Chris, that gets to a fundamental point, because we often have debates between those who advocate you need a dedicated person or entity responsible for innovation, and I call that the othering of innovation. Where the real rich ideas come from are in the actual practice of the business that you're in, the conduct of the work you're in, and mobilizing that grassroots local innovation where you get the richness out of actually innovation of value. And so you need a little of both. You need people who are precipitators and incubators, and you need people who are dedicated to not being the tyranny of the day and actually dedicate resources and time to not mortgaging our future, but you need to mobilize that grassroots creativity in the conduct of actual business and work, where you find the richness to actually do things of value. Otherwise, it's tech for tech's sake, or
Activity for activity's sake.
Activity for activity's sake, yes.
Thank you, because it's a good segue into, I asked the question, from whence does innovation emerge? And one of our military liaisons, John Gillis, Marine Sergeant John Gillis, where are you, John? Put your hand in the air. Thanks. Sitting up front. So John gave a presentation at the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum in Chicago last October. And his premise was that junior enlisted in the military are the most untapped source of innovation in the military. If you haven't seen it, Google it. It's on YouTube. It's a fantastic talk. To that point, John's a sergeant of Marines. There's lots of people above him. There's lots of people on his left and right. So General Selva, how do we get more out of, or how do we give voice, an innovation voice, to young Marines like John and junior Marines, airmen, soldiers, et cetera? How do we do that?
So I think there's two things we can do. I'm not sure either is completely adequate. One is we inspire leaders to ask the question. So if you look at our military, it's unique in a couple of respects. One is the education and expertise of our enlisted corps. They're all volunteers and they're all professionals. They didn't get that way by accident, right? So that makes us different. The second is the amount of responsibility that we give young men and women who are in our enlisted corps, which is very different than the design of most militaries around the world. They are generally our technical experts. They are certainly experts in tactics, techniques, and procedures, and leading their fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in a way that's unique to our military. And so it's not just about giving them a voice, it's about encouraging our senior leaders to listen, because they are the engine that brings innovation into our organizations. I've actually watched it happen mostly with industrial processes around logistics, because that area is fraught with inefficiencies. And our young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines don't want to put up with it. And so we ought to listen to them. The same is true of small unit tactics. they're the people that are out there doing the work every day, and we ought to listen to them. So encouraging leaders to do that. I describe the ecosystem this way. In the department, specifically the Defense Department, innovation is like a forest fire. We mobilize all of our firefighters to put it out. What we need to do is start small brush fires, prove that our ideas are useful, and then scale those ideas to the institution. And that's a laborious process of doctrine development and tactics, techniques, and procedures development. But in the end, if you can bring efficiency to the combat arms, that's about effectiveness on the battlefield. And that means our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have a better chance of victory. And it is from our youngest enlisted force that most of those ideas come.
Can I?
Please, Soraya, please.
If I may. I agree. I agree. Fundamentally, that is true across the board. I think that's where we sometimes hold ourselves back because we think that the leaders have the ideas. And the reality is what the leaders should be doing is inspiring and motivating the staff, especially the staff that's out there doing the day-to-day work, because they're the ones that have the bright ideas. They know the process, they understand the problem better than any of us, and we have to give them an opportunity to present their ideas. But the other thing that we have to do as leaders is have an appetite for failure. Because sometimes you're going to, I call it stubbing your toe, I don't like the word failure, but sometimes you're going to stub your toe, you're going to make mistakes, and all too often in our government, one of the things that we do is we don't reward that failure. We don't acknowledge it, or when we acknowledge it the wrong way. The stakeholders, whether it's the Hill, the GAOs, the IGs, what they come out and do is criticize. And we can learn a lot from those mistakes. In fact, I would challenge that every successful person, these successful individuals will tell you, as I will tell you, we failed once or twice in our careers. That's why we're successful.
And innovation's not efficient.
What's that now?
Right. Innovation's not efficient.
Right.
Right. The way to be
messy.
efficient is to do the exact same thing in a routinized way and minimize all risk, all the way down to the, to Toyota levels, down to zero. Innovation's a kind of a hot mess most of the time.
It's a little scary too.
I would just add, you can optimize a system for creativity. You can also optimize a system to prevent failure. But you cannot do both at the same time.
Correct. That is very
So there are parts of the military mission where you're willing to sacrifice creativity and maybe process innovation and the rest, because those particular missions have a unique challenge. But one size does not fit all. And I agree with you about what you said about failure. We all make mistakes. The question is, are we making new mistakes?
Right.
We shouldn't be making the same old mistakes. There are things that are known not to work, right? And we should just not do those, right? But if you're trying to do something new, if you're trying to push a limit, you're trying out a different kind of technique to try and reshape the process, and you learn something about what works and what doesn't, that's very useful. That shouldn't be a failure. At the same time, if you're in a position and there's no catastrophic failure on your shift, but you know the systems are becoming obsolete, you know you have security problems, you know you have deficiencies, and somehow you don't do anything, that should be considered a failure. It would be considered a failure in almost every industry. That kind of accountability for allowing things to slowly fail without noise is something that is one of the most troubling things that I see.
We tend not to oftentimes, I know in the intelligence community, not approach this from a holistic risk decision perspective. It's not being able to capture what is the opportunity cost of not undertaking introduction or assimilation of a new capability, but the status quo, the incremental, just optimize for efficiency or continuity. And so I think we need to look at this more holistically as what the potentially much greater mission gain from a disruptive approach, disruptive technology. Yes, it may entail some cost, but that embrace of that new capability, that new way of doing things can be so much more enabling and yield so much more payoff, it's worth the smaller cost.
But I think we've all experienced people that we've worked with who have either bought into what you've just described or they have not. So Milo, to your description of a failure, how do we loosely or tightly categorize it? Is it a recruiting failure? Is it a training failure? Is it a hard problem failure? Is it a culture failure? And then we have to set out about what we do to become at least as best and efficiently innovative as we possibly can. But what is it? So do we have a culture problem? Do we have a talent problem? Do we have a recruiting problem? What do we have?
We've been to a number of installations, different commands, and I would just say the quality of the people and the quality of the training is phenomenal. I think you can really be proud of the military, of the men and women in our armed services. It's universally impressive. I think part of the challenge is how do you equip them with tools that they can actually impact their situation? So, for example, at Google, right? Individuals have access to thousands of cores of compute without actually doing any paperwork, without doing any resource request. Any engineer can get them. We have this 20%. Gmail, how many of you are Gmail users out here in this crowd?
All of Georgetown University.
Gmail was an idea that an engineer had, not on his OKRs, not on his performance list. He just put it together because he thought it would be a better thing to do. It's under our 20% kind of policy. But he didn't have to go procure a set of servers. He didn't have to go through an RFP process. He had access to a set of resources that he could do that with. And after a few weeks, a bunch of other engineers said, this is really cool, I want to use that. And then a decision was made, well, let's weaponize it. Let's turn it into a real product, right? And so if you've got somebody who's got a great idea, but in order for them to test it out, in order for them to put it into practice, you have to go through an acquisition cycle, you have to go dedicate some resources to it. There's no abundance of compute. There's no abundance of network. There's no abundance of resource for them to be 3D printers, things like that empower them to test their idea and iterate rapidly. You're going to snuff that out because it's too hard, right?
So let me be contrarian.
Yeah.
So I'm a taxpayer. And you're a federal.
We are too.
Yeah, no. Right. So what I just heard you say is Google has built in, I'm going to be contrarian on purpose. So Google has built into their infrastructure 20% excess. 20% of your engineer's time is available to do whatever the hell they please, as long as it's a good idea. May or may not be marketable, may or may not be scalable. And Google's fine with that because it might result in a really good idea that could be brought to the market. And I'm okay with all of that. But if you flip that on its head and you say, okay, now it's the federal government, specifically it's the Department of Defense, and we're going to reserve 20% of our intellectual time and effort, 20% of our resources to experiment.
Hear, hear.
Do you have a sense of the scale of that notion?
I would just say to that, first off, we would love to have more engineers do creative things like that. Most of the engineers don't spend time doing that. It's available to them, but they don't take the option. But I do think in the Valley, this issue about access to abundance and of compute and the ability to go try things out easily, you don't necessarily need 20% of the DoD's budget to do this or 20% of the engineer's time. But I would just say, how's it working for you otherwise, right?
Depends on your product.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
The question is really if you believe that things are great and that you've got the level of innovation that's necessary to deal with adversaries who can operate in shorter time intervals, who can field new systems and iterate and develop new capabilities faster than we are, if you think that that's a problem, then it's not going to get addressed by doing things the way we've done them. And I think that's the question. What is the kind of impetus to change? And I think you can try these things out and see how well they work, but enabling the workforce, who is already, I think, extremely capable with the kind of tools that empowers them to create, empowers them to try things, empowers them to field new capability, under a construct where it's not
That's what I'm trying to
open,
draw out. Yeah.
unless, free run. I think, a kite flies when it's tethered a little bit, right? So I think it's that balance.
But isn't what you...
But I think we're way on one side of that today.
I'm sorry, so if I could give you an example of how I'm doing innovation and procurement, and I'm not trying to boil the ocean, I can't do every single project. But what we've done is we've stood up a procurement innovation lab. It's a virtual lab. I have a team of about 3 people who will work with folks on real projects where they want to try something new. And what we do is talk through that process, because we want to minimize failure, we really do, but we want to manage the risks associated with it. And what we try to do is say, bring us your idea, we're going to apply it to a project that we're working on right now, because the worst that could happen is we might have to course correct. Now, in my world, that's a little bit easier to do. And I guess what I'm saying is it's all about weighing risks. It's all about inviting people to bring the idea to the table. Not every idea can be tried where you sit, right? Sometimes you have to bring the idea forward and say, look, I'm thinking that we can do this differently. Can we go try this somewhere? And in the government, we do have to be careful, because I'm going to tell you, I'm just 36 years in the government, I can tell you, when we fail, everybody points that out. When we do something crazy, everybody points it out, right? In reality, a lot of the things that we do are opportunities for learning, and we have to encourage that in people. We have to embrace that. So I stood up this Procurement Innovation Lab. We've run about, I think it's a total of 21 projects through there. 9 have been successfully completed, and we found new ways to get things done quicker. We found ways to get evaluators in and out of an evaluation room looking at 100 proposals in 3 weeks or less. That's like unheard of. Nobody does that. We found ways to work with non-traditional companies, companies who are new starts that have ideas that they want to bring to the table. We found ways to bring them in, enable them to submit a proposal on 7 pieces of paper as opposed to reams of paper, to get a decision from us in about 45 minutes time, and to also get a contract within 10 to 45 days, depending on any intellectual property negotiations.
At what scope, Soraya? At what scope? How large of a contract are we talking about?
So it depends on what you're buying, but typically on these new innovations, we do it in phases. We fund in phases up to $200,000 per phase. And the longest one took 45 days, the shortest one took 10 days. To give an example. But those are ways that I've challenged my folks to do that. And I will tell you that when we started 2 years ago, I took a survey. 70% of the folks came back and told us fear and cultural resistance was the reason that they didn't try to innovate where they sit. Today, 43% said that they believe that we have a larger appetite for innovation, and about 50% said, not sure if you have a larger appetite for it, but we see the world changing before us.
So, interestingly enough, what you've all described over the last 10 to 15 minutes is really the premise of Hacking for Defense. Started by legendary entrepreneur, Silicon Valley entrepreneur Steve Blank, Joe Felter, Pete Newell, and others. They came up with a process that we call Hacking for Defense, which has 3, I won't go through the whole thing now. You can go to hacking4defensegu.com and learn more. But it's basically 3 steps that we take. 1, frame your hypothesis, and we use a mission model canvas to do that. 2, get out of the building and do what we call beneficiary discovery, because it's not really customers within the government space. Get as close to as many people who are being touched by this problem as you possibly can, and elicit as much information as you can from them. And then 3, solve the problem. Get a minimum viable product every week, and we do that every week for 13 weeks. We gave them the week off tonight so they could come do this, but we're starting again tomorrow. Just there's no time off. Well, let's get to the macro part of this a little bit. Just last week, President Trump established the White House Office of American Innovation. The National Trade Council has a special assistant for the Defense Industrial Base. Certainly we have a DASD, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, under which my good friend Jay Harrison right here from MD5, the director of MD5, falls. We've got, there are 330 different labs across the federal space. 90 of them are in the DoD area. The DoD spends about $140 billion a year on R&D. That is more than Amazon, Google, and, well, everybody else combined. DHS, on the other hand, in their 2017 budget, requested $1.63 billion for research and development. So if we just accept the difference in size of the two organizations, and we have all of these different subparts of the organization, the Defense Innovation Board, we have Presidential Innovation Fellows, DIUX, Incutel, MD5, DARPA, IARPA, the Defense Digital Service, 18F, and everybody else.
You forgot SCO.
And the Strategic Capabilities Office with Will Roper. We've got all of this stuff. Does anybody know what the other person is doing in their innovation lives so that we can share ideas across that ecosystem, so that we can make more efficient use of our innovation dollars going across?
The offices in DARPA don't even know what the other offices do. And so the only people, the people who know that answer are the people, are vendors who are hustling to talk to all the different offices, or the CETAs, right, the Science, Engineering, Technical Assistants, who actually do incredible work in this space. And for those of you who might be on the job market at some point in the next few years, CETA support is an incredible way to get involved in government service that most folks on the policy side don't know a lot about. No one has any idea. It's fantastically fashioned cylinders of excellence. And unless you really make it your business to spend a fair amount of time talking to people on the government side, on the vendor side, in the academic side, you have no idea what's going on. It's a fantastic challenge, but not one that the government seems particularly interested in solving.
So I'm going to challenge that a little bit.
Good.
Because
I
don't
figured
agree
you
with
would.
that. Well, because we don't have a massive budget for research and development, and because we are an agency that really was stood up from multiple agencies. One of the things that I think DHS has done relatively well, I'm not going to say we're perfect at it, is we do reach to the other agencies. We do talk to the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and we go and try to understand what they're working on and share ideas and innovate. The other thing that we've been doing, especially over the last 2 years, is talking to industry a lot more. We've actually, I stood up an initiative, we call it Acquisition Innovations in Motion, where I go out and talk to industry at the strategic level, and I bring with me the technical experts of the agency to talk about the real problems that we're trying to solve, to put in front of industry, whether it's startups or existing large manufacturing companies. Here are the kinds of problems we're trying to solve. Here are the issues that we confront. Here is the limitations that we have to work with. And to help them start thinking about how they can help us solve the problems. The other things that we're doing are trying to mold that into our procurement processes so that we are creating a procurement process that enables people to bring us ideas from the outside. So I'm not going to say we're perfect, but I'm going to say that we are reaching out, that we do talk to the 18Fs, the digital services, and everybody out there, you know, name the whole alphabet soup. We're out there talking to people constantly on a very regular basis, trying to work with our fellow government partners as well as industry, and we do talk to the startup community quite a bit. We actually do visits around the country to talk to the startups.
I would agree. I mean, I wouldn't say it's quite as bleak as no one knows what the other one's doing, but there is room for improvement for sure. But you know, we have a presence in the Valley. We spend a fair amount of time working with DIUX and with Incutel and think about how do we, for example, on-ramp our Incutel investments into our Amazon marketplace, with which we have a strategic relationship. How do we do that so it's both leveraging the value that the Incutel vendors bring, the startup community brings, but then gives them a revenue stream they might not have otherwise because they don't have, you know, that entree to the marketplace. So I think we have room to grow, we have room to align more in that space, but I don't think it's quite that bleak.
So let me put a different spin on it, and that is a lot of the R&D that DoD does is unique to DoD. I mean, how many of you have a utility for high energetics? That's the stuff inside the bomb that goes kaboom.
I suppose
we can all
that
find
depends on
something.
to whom you're addressing.
So most of you don't. Many of you might. So we have a whole stream
We've
of
got some traffic problems we can
Yeah.
direct you against.
So there's a whole stream of research and development in basic sciences inside the Defense Department on things that are unique to defense. And I think we have to actually subdivide why we do that research, because nobody else will do it. There isn't an industrial incentive
Yet.
for much of that research to be done until we get it to the point that we can operationalize it. And then we put it in the hands of one of our industry partners who can bring it into our capacity to fight this complex war fight that we're involved in. But there is spillover all over the enterprise. I have a unique experience in aeromedical evacuation. So when I came to the enterprise of aeromedical evacuation, in order to evacuate a heart patient, it took 7 crew members and a piece of technology twice the size of that coffee table. Because of the urgency of aeromedical evacuation, through military research and development, we miniaturized that piece of technology called an extracorporeal oxygenation system from twice the size of that coffee table to 1 cubic foot, that a surgeon can cut a main line into a patient, and that machine can exchange and oxygenate all of their blood over the course of whatever their flight is, from the battlefield injury to definitive medical care. That was a military innovation. That technology is now available across all of our EMTs nationwide and now expanding worldwide. That's an innovation that happened inside the military with military R&D to save lives on the battlefield that has now permeated the industry. And there are dozens of examples like that. So I think when we talk about how much research and development the Defense Department does, and we use the dollar amount without actually stipulating the parts of the enterprise that benefit from that research, and then the ability to export much of that research into the civilian economy, I think we sell ourselves short. I don't dispute, by the way, that in some segments of our innovation enterprise, we have cylinders of excellence that are essentially hiding from each other what they're doing. And I think as leaders, we owe it to the enterprise to break down those boundaries. It's not an accident that I actually go to national laboratories and ask them what they're up to. Every quarter I go out to DARPA and get a briefing on what they're up to. And guess what? Once a quarter, we bring DARPA into the Joint Requirements Oversight Council
Yeah, they love that.
and expose all the vice chiefs of the services to what DARPA's up to, because it makes a difference.
I've built some of those briefs. Those are fun.
Yeah, it's about breaking down the boundaries. Yeah,
So,
exactly right.
sir, you mentioned before that you were a taxpayer.
As we all are.
Yes, we are. Well, we hope so. April 15th is coming up.
I'm not going there with you.
Something like 50% of the citizenry doesn't actually pay any
See,
tax.
we are not going to
Pay
derail
sales
this.
tax,
No,
they
no,
pay
no.
Payroll tax.
No,
I don't want to hear it.
We're not going to derail this.
Sorry.
So you're a taxpayer, and you just described the investment that particularly DoD makes in innovation, and then those innovations ultimately permeate into the civilian sector. Do you think the government gets the proper return from that investment? If what you discover, there's a professor at the University of Sussex, Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and she makes the case that first government gets a bad rap on whether or not it's innovative or not, and in fact, there's the secret history of Silicon Valley. If you haven't seen that or watched that, Steve Blank does a great presentation on that, but innovative enterprise from the government is across the board, and she uses the example of the iPhone, and that pretty much everything that's in the iPhone is the result of some sort of either initial government investment or stronger government investment. So my question is, as a taxpayer, as the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the money that you authorize and spend, do we get the proper yield from all of that work that you do?
So do you want to talk to the taxpayer or the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs? You have to stipulate.
Either one who wants to go first is fine, sir.
So I'll do this by example, not as a statement of yes or no. How many of you are willing to pay for the precision navigation and timing signal that drives your phone? Anybody? I would. How much you willing to pay? How do we bill you? That's GPS.
Yep.
By the way, every bank on the planet uses GPS to synchronize their monetary exchange systems.
And so do the cell phone operators.
Yeah. So, the reason I picked that one is it affects everybody in this room, whether you like it or not. And that's an innovation that was actually designed to allow the Defense Department to invent and field precision-guided munitions. That's the impetus for GPS wasn't to make our lives better, easier, more efficient, more effective. It was to blow stuff up. Everything else is a side benefit.
P for plenty, sir.
So,
I agree.
So the question is, do we seek any payment for that capability, or do we simply say it's allowed for an astronomical change in the way our economy works?
And indirect benefits potentially in terms of economic growth and tax revenue and a variety of other things.
So why would we squelch?
Unless you move, okay, I wasn't going to do this, but we're bringing it up. Unless you move your headquarters to Dublin or somewhere else where you're paying near zero U.S. tax, where do we get, I understand the argument. We're not going to solve it here. I'm just saying the point is it's a difficult thing. All I want to know is, do we get the return on all the amazing work that everybody in the DoD is doing with $140 billion of research and development?
So the place where I would say we get the return is in combat effectiveness and the survival of our forces in the modern battle space.
There you go.
If that's an adequate return for that investment, and I would argue it is, then as the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I say we're getting our money's worth.
I agree.
But there's a business model question, Chris, that's trickier to work out. Having run a company that took DARPA money to build software, right? DARPA is moved for the most part, not exclusively, but in its big data and cyber office in particular, to focus on open source software development. And the taxpayer in me, and the person who doesn't like subbing to Lockheed Martin very much, thinks that's a pretty good idea, right? It's this taxpayer-funded, research and development. It should be open across a variety of services and agencies outside the DoD, all the way down at the unit level, however you want to do it. As a CEO, that's a tougher road to hoe. What am I doing after so I built it. Let's say it works. That'd be great, wouldn't it? So let's you meet the requirement, and now you want to sell it to someone, but it's got minimum government use rights across the entire USG space. Who am I supposed to sell that to, especially if it was designed for a particular intelligence optimization problem or a particular threat assessment sort of problem? I would have built it differently if I was building it for Wall Street. Right? I would have built a different UI. I would have included different data streams. I would have built the algorithms potentially differently, right? So this I think is part of the real current challenge on the innovation side for the government on the software side, that the business model and the taxpayer incentives don't line up. And that's a huge hurdle to get over.
The question I would ask is there an intersection between that commercially available software that was developed for, some would argue, a unique commercial application that we can then bring into the department and bring efficiencies to the department? And one of the places that
Sure, but that DARPA won't touch that.
Oh, I don't think that's necessarily true, because I've actually challenged them in this space. To actually help come up with processes and software that will help us with big data analytics, that will get at the things we've become very good at in the counterterrorism space, actually have implications for the broader conventional warfight, pattern recognition, developing patterns of life. If I ask intelligence analysts to do that, they'll take an image the size of that coffee table and they'll look at the glass. But an algorithm that looks for patterns across that entire image or set of images is agnostic to the individual objects. It's looking for the general patterns. And if it can identify patterns that are important to us and assist humans in making faster decisions, why wouldn't we go there? And those are the kind of challenges we're putting in front of some of the engineers at DARPA. By the way, at the very same time, we're putting them in the hands of software developers in the Valley and saying, if you can beat DARPA to the solution, knock yourself out.
Right.
Yeah, I think that area is an area where machine learning and AI actually have the strongest, clearest ability to make impact in the short term. Computer vision is a mature technology.
Right.
And I think part of the problem that we see, that I see in DoD with being able to exploit these is lack of training data. DoD doesn't store data in a way that's easily accessible for training outside of specific silos. And oftentimes, you'll have aircraft that will be fifth generation aircraft who collect a ton of operational statistics and data, but none of that is uploaded after every mission and able to be mined for training data that can help optimize algorithms, right? So I think part of the struggle is how do you create the sort of training data that these systems can actually use to really make machine learning deliver on its promise for those kind of reconnaissance, pattern matching, et cetera. That's a deep space.
So let's talk, Milo, it's a good point. Let's talk about emerging technologies for a second. So last week, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said that artificial intelligence in a form that we should be concerned about was 50 to 100 years away and shouldn't even be on our radar. But AI work is a core pillar of the third offset strategy that the Department of Defense is working on. Eric Schmidt, Executive Chairman of Google, also Chairman of the Defense Innovation Board, at the Future of War conference said, yeah, it's like 5 years away, and we should probably be paying attention to it. And you, sir, said with regard to the Terminator conundrum, that within 5 to 10 years, we could be facing artificial intelligence that could actually fire on its own without human input, completely violating the human-in-the-loop imperative. Holy cow, first. Skynet is here. Second of all, what do we do? Like, what I don't know even what.
One of us is right.
Yes. Well, I was going to say who's right, but I didn't want to put you. But somebody's got. Well, look, if we're working between 5 and 100 years, it's a pretty good bet that one of you are going to be correct. So what does that mean?
I would just say it's important to separate out what we think of as general purpose AI, truly general AI. That is not just around the corner, right? On the other hand, machine learning, AI, these kind of things that are not, you train the systems, you use that in increasing levels of scope in looking at different problems. Some of that is actually not just not around the corner, it's actually mature and should be used in the operational context today. So the engineer in me always says, it depends, right? What you mean by that. I think part of the challenge is with machine learning is we can do amazing things with machine learning, right? AlphaGo, play to move, right? That we all thought was a mistake, but turned out to be brilliant. It was a brand new move that people hadn't ever sort of contemplated before. And it figured it out by itself. But then the question is, why did it play that move? Tell me why. Why does it tell you that? Why did it pick a baby picture of my 13-year-old daughter and Google Photos, map it to her automatically in my collection of photos? Why did it do that? Right? Who knows? The machine learning, part of the challenge right now is if the system won't tell you, you can't really tell why it's giving you this answer.
Which makes it vulnerable to adversarial AI.
Yeah, it depends on the training data, right? I mean, what are you trying to model and map into that? So these are sort of limitations in the space, but that's not the sort of fully general purpose AI that is being talked
And I
about.
think it's really important to define terms.
Yes.
Narrow AI is about teaching machines to do specific tasks. General AI is the T1000, right? General AI is this sort of self-aware machine that thinks it knows what's right and wrong.
Right.
You tell it, it learns it, and it goes and does it. We are likely a century away from generalized self-aware AI.
Which means, sir, the experience has been when everybody says we're likely a century away, we're really only likely 15 years away, right?
Even if we're 50 or 15, the issue isn't whether we can get to general AI for me. The issue is whether or not a person or a country or an adversary would take narrow AI and build it into a system that allows a weapon to take a human life without the intervention of a human. And so I build a set of algorithms that I have confidence in. And I say, every gray-haired guy with a flat top is a target, and you can take them whenever you want.
I will not be getting a haircut for a while then.
So you have created now this narrow piece of AI that can take a human life without consultation with another human. I don't think we need to go there. I think what we can do is employ narrow AI to empower humans to make decisions faster in an ever-increasingly complex battle space. And so to be able to sift through the kinds of things that decision makers have to sift through, to get at an adversary in a high-speed, very complex battle space, you have to be able to sense the patterns of your adversary's behavior quickly. You have to then empower a decision quickly. And the third part of that equation is you have to be able to act at that kind of speed. So if we're creating slow weapons to operate on a fast battle space, we're going to get our clock cleaned. So you have to address all three. And that's where we're trying to war game in the third offset that you referred to earlier is, what does that imply for this new battle space? If you have an aware system that informs decision makers quickly, and as quickly as they decide, they can act. That ought to change the dynamic in that battle space.
I think it's really important that we be intentional about the decision about what the man does and what the machine does. Right. So often the systems user interfaces, the things we see that I've seen on some of these visits, have been appalled at the sort of choices or lack of intentionality about those choices. And I think those are things that we need to rethink. You know, you see MQ-9 pilots stare at a building for hours, waiting for someone to come out. That is a problem that computer vision should solve. You should not have people be staring at things, waiting for people to come out of buildings, right? That's exactly right. So why is it that continues, right? Who's decided that is the more optimal thing for the person to do as opposed to the computer or the weapon system?
The decision to put explosive ordnance on that individual.
Different issue.
Is different issue.
Totally
Exactly.
different issue. Totally different issue.
And we talk about this often in the abstract of as if the machine learning, the artificial intelligence advances and matures, and the human mind and the human understanding of how to apply that stays static. And I don't think that's
exactly right.
So what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask two questions and then ask us to comment on them quickly because I want to get to audience questions if there are any. I'm assuming there will be. So two questions. We're at one of the finest universities in the country. The mission of the Security Studies program here is to help seed the national security ecosystem with the very best talent that we possibly can, whether they decide to go into academia and study it, whether they decide to go into the private sector and serve it, or whether they really go on the other side of the service coin, work for the government. I think that requires a lot of really smart people. And we have 20 of them, of our students here today, and you know, if I haven't told you, you're doing amazing work, and we want many, many, many more of this type of people. But just two quick things. This year, American universities reported a 40% drop in foreign student applications. And the first question is, what, if anything, does that do to our innovation culture broadly, but certainly with regard to national security? Two, and something that's personal for me, is education itself is being disrupted by all kinds of technology. But there are people who still cling to traditional methods, and in some cases that works. But I just want to cite a couple of statistics. Right now, I think it's 1 in 8 high schools in America actually teaches a computer science course. 31 of 50 states don't count that course for a math or science credit. In 2013, 30,000 people who took the AP Computer Science exam, less than 20% were female, 3% were African American, and 8% were Latino. So my question is, how do we, through the education system, get to the young, mixed race girl sitting in the corner with pigtails and broken glasses to be able to participate in what we need to have solved? How do we do that?
That girl's way too cool to be wearing pigtails, first of all.
What do we do? How can we communicate? I mean, I suppose the answer is talk to your congressman, protest, go to a town hall meeting, all that stuff. Got it. What do we do to get those, to give those young kids a voice who may be some of our most brilliant, strategic, scientific, mathematic, policy minds to be sitting in an audience like this today? That's a mic drop.
Well, I would just say there are a number of things that can be done to change the incentive structure around. People are amazingly incentive-driven, and so you talk about how technology is changing the education apparatus. Really?
No.
Really? I don't think it's changed it tactically, but it hasn't changed it strategically.
Say more.
So you look at, you've got computers in the classroom, but we have the same sort of structural programs. The public school system is generally heavily regulated. You have unions, right? You have a number of metrics that are used to determine how well the system performs, but how does that get reinforced in terms of teacher salaries and the rest? My sister is a high school math teacher in the Central Valley, so this is a deep topic of interest. You don't have a situation where parents can choose what schools to send to, so there's no incentive to necessarily compete and do better in that system. I'm an engineer, so I look at things in kind of odd ways. If you wanted more STEM graduates out of universities, maybe you have financial aid for STEM, but not for lawyers. Maybe you get more engineers than lawyers. I think that's probably a good ratio. It's like thrust to weight ratio in an aircraft. So I think really, if you're serious about it, right, we can create incentives. We can try and generate better role models. We can try and have better impacts. But the areas where we see the least amount of strategic impact of technology, strategic impact of innovation, tend to be the areas which are the most regulated.
Correct.
Because you can't change the process. The process has been determined by the regulator, and so consequently, you can't change that process, changing the regulation, which is a interesting dynamic.
So I would just point out, and I am being flippant, you've just described the acquisition system as well. 2,000 pages of the federal acquisition regulation, protests. Basically what you get out of the system, is an RFP really represents instructions to put together an entertainment center, and they ask vendors, what day labor and how quickly can you get it done? We buy a C+.
So let me push on this from 2 points. I don't really want to defend the FAR, but
Go right ahead, because I'm going to jump in there.
but it's interesting. You know, I used to work for NASA. I was actually a government employee when I was younger. And it was interesting because I never expected to work in the government permanently, right? I cared a lot about actually getting some things done while I was there. And I would run RFPs, and I would talk to the acquisition people, et cetera, and I would say, hey, I want to do this. And they would say, well, we don't think that's wise. And I would go, interesting. I learned after a while that meant that it's probably I have the authority to do it, but they don't want me to do it. So I read the FAR, at least the parts that were pertinent, and I would say, I think I have authority to do this. And they would say, yes. But we don't think it's wise. We don't think it's wise. And so I would say, well, I think we're going to do it anyway, right? And they didn't like that, but generally you went along, and through a combination of positive reinforcement and humiliation, you could motivate the workforce to get stuff done. But this is what a Air Force colonel at the Air Force Academy called self-denial of service, right? We are doing a self-denial of service attack upon ourselves, right? Because we have authorities, but we choose not to use them. Now, I'm not saying that the system is optimized, because again, the issue is you partition acquisition into individual programs where you're not allowed to take a crack at reinventing the process. And so that's part of the problem too. Bill Perry has a book, Standing at the Brink. I thought it was interesting. I was reading it on the flight out to Washington. And there's this interesting quote from his time during the 80s. He said, we have this acquisition system which operates in 10 to 15 year increments. I think we can actually cut this in half, right, with work. And because in his first period when he was DDRE, he basically bypassed it for important things like stealth and precision-guided munitions. But then he wanted to go after it. And it was interesting, this is in the 80s, talking about the time frame of acquisition. And I think we talk a lot about cost, we talk a lot about efficiency, but we don't talk about, I think, the single most important factor, which is time. Because if our adversaries can out-innovate us inside our loop, that's a big problem. And time, actually, I think, can capture expense as well. It turns out it's very hard to spend money, a lot of money quickly. So if you actually said, you know what, we're going to work on a program and it's going to be a 5-year program, but we're going to have 4 of those instead of, one 20-year program. I actually think you'll end up saving money in the end, and you'll be able to innovate and iterate faster. And there are areas where the government actually does this. Nuclear reactors on submarines, there's constant improvement that goes on in that. But that's not something that we do broadly. And I'm very concerned that the pace of innovation, the pace of capability evolution in the commercial marketplace is going to be adopted by our opponents and integrated into their systems and tactics on a much faster basis than we can adapt it, because of partly how we think about acquisition, but also partly just we're comfortable with things taking a long time.
I would agree with that comment. And I would agree with what you said about the regulations. I kind of know them a little bit. I don't think the regulations hold us back. What holds us back is risk aversion. It is about people who either have gotten burned before, lost the protest, whatever it is, whether it's the lawyer, the contract specialist, or even the program office that says, I'm not going to try this. Most of the things that we're doing in our Procurement Innovation Lab are within the confines of the FAR. We haven't gone out for any changes in regulations. We haven't violated any regulations. We haven't done any deviations from the regulations. There is a lot of flexibility built into that document. What's not built into that document is that appetite for risk for taking certain levels of risk to say, I am going to go and have one-on-ones with industry, or I'm going to bring a group of industry people, and I'm not going to sit there and give them a piece of paper. I'm actually going to have a conversation with them. Those are the kinds of things that hold us back, and those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to change through the Procurement Innovation Lab. One of the comments that I will make is we have been reforming acquisition in the federal government for as long as I've been in the federal government. You ever notice that? We've been reforming acquisition. There's a panel every other day stood up to tell us how to do this. And
So what's the report card? What's the metric that you use
exactly.
to define success in acquisition reform? Is it time frame of
Should be.
process? Is it success of the program? What's your metric? Because if you don't have a metric that you can define, it's going to be very difficult to manage that program to.
Okay, but we put a man on the moon without the FAR. Why do I need it now?
Actually, we didn't.
1974 was when we first put it out.
That's
We
right.
put it-
They had something worse than the FAR. There was a different set of
a
regulations.
minor
and they
set
were
of
worse.
regulations.
And they were worse.
A minor set of regulations.
You know, but
Okay.
I have a friend at TradeOc though who likes to remind folks that they've earned every one of those regs in the FAR. Yeah. Some idiot, some
something.
clown, some
Right.
joker, some
So-
individual who either was very risk acceptant or was just very clueless, earned every
Generally,
one of
it's
those
the clueless
regs.
ones that
So
bring us
I would
the
make
regs.
I would assert process does not trump competence.
Correct.
Process does not trump competence. So what happens, the reason the FAR looks the
If
way
I
it
could fire
does,
people in the federal government, I might be able to agree with that.
process does not trump competence. You end up in a situation where I have a failure in a program, so we're going to memorialize this with some process changes as opposed to how do we empower people to make better decisions? How do we avoid that? How do we get more data earlier in the program to know that this thing went off track? How do we change the culture about what failure means and how we hold people accountable? Because if being compliant with a process is a definition of success, right? Which tends to be the mantra in acquisition, right? Think about how many companies would have that. I'm compliant with process. I'm a success. Maybe your cable company.
Every vendor
But-
in the industry writes a compliance matrix, ghosts everybody else. I mean, it's a. Sorry, don't get me started. It's so what I'd like to do, if I may, is
Can
yes,
I
please.
interject something though, because you're putting that back on the acquisition community. The acquisition community does not write the regulations. Who is writing these regulations are the legislators. They are the folks out there that hear about the dumb mistake that somebody made, the violation to a conflict of interest issue, and they come out with these regulations, or sometimes it's court cases that give us that because we get those. So I don't think it's necessarily to put it back on us. We have created a culture of risk aversion. We have to change that. That's called leadership. That is called also training people. We have to teach people how to make decisions in the acquisition cycle. And I agree with you, metrics are important. And what are the metrics we should measure? We should measure a whole slew of metrics.
Well, this would be a very boring conversation if we weren't provocative about these things anyway. General Selva keeps looking at me every once in a while, like going, Chris, come on, man, that was... Okay, what we'd like to do is open it up, open it up to the audience for some questions. This is the mic back here, so if you have a question for everyone, please go ahead and line up. While we're getting lined up, let me just point something out. If you want to comment, yes. If not, the other day there was a troubling article in the New York Times about Chinese investors investing in U.S. startups that couldn't attract U.S. capital for technologies that might have national security significance. If we righted one over budget, over cost program, we would be able to give MD5, IARPA, DARPA, 18F, everybody, a whole ton of money and scale them so that we could get out there and capture the value that's being created that we can't see with the scope that we have right now. Talk amongst yourselves.
Is it a budget problem, or is it a not interested in responding to your RFP and participating in the FAR process problem?
It's probably all of the above.
Okay.
But
Stephen with industry.
There's only like
gonna be a
1,200
riot.
people.
Jesus.
okay, do we have some? Wow,
Yeah,
holy cow!
you get to pick.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
How
Thank
long
you
are we
so much
going?
for being here tonight.
Tutu, can you speak up a little bit more into the?
Yeah. Okay. I hope this is fine. So I'm Teuta. I'm a second year graduate student here at Georgetown University, and I'm at the Security Studies program. I'm also taking the Hacking for Defense class. And so my question is, so what do you think the US should be doing about some of the restrictions in using foreign technology in regards, as related to the security field? So what do you think are some of the ways that we can better leverage foreign technology for security purposes here?
That's a good question.
Anyone?
That's a tough one.
I mean, it's a global economy. There's lots of cool stuff going on in the rest of the world. Some of it might be useful to what we're trying to do. So I'll put it to Andrew and to General Selva. How do you take advantage of that?
Yeah, the reality is that with the globalization of technology, it's even if you try to look for US-only solutions, you're probably not getting US-only solutions. But I do think we have to think more broadly about how do we leverage what is going around the globe, and certainly within inside the intelligence community, that requires again a risk-based decision about how do we do this in a way that we can do safely with counterintelligence concerns, dependency concerns. How do we do that in a way that doesn't leave us behind, so far behind technologically that we've missed the boat entirely? So yeah, we have to find a way to do that, bottom line.
So I would echo that. I think as we look at bringing foreign technologies into the national defense enterprise, we need to be conscious of the potential vulnerabilities that we bring with those technologies, be they weapons systems or information management systems that empower those weapons systems. We have to be really careful on what kind of vulnerabilities we bring in. And so I think we just have to be conscious of that space. It is a global economy. We actually look very carefully at the development of weapon systems and the components in those weapon systems to determine which ones of those might be vulnerable to intrusion by potential adversaries. And we actually try to fence some of those off, and that's really hard to do.
And also
when
the
things
production
like,
loss.
yeah, where
right?
chips
If
come
foreign
from
government
other
were to
places.
stop export of those.
So I mean, I think it's true. The least sexy and one of the most difficult challenges we face in national security is global supply chain safety, by far. People don't like to do a whole bunch on it. It's not at the top of everybody's research list. It's a very difficult thing, but it really is one of the most important things that we have going on. Okay, thank you, Toita.
My name is Donna Artuzzi. I'm also in the Security Studies program, and I'm a research assistant for it as well in Hacking for Defense. So thank you all for being here this evening. My question has two interrelated parts, but I'll try to keep it very brief. How do you see the international cooperation with specific regard to innovation with regard to artificial intelligence technology as a means to significantly augmenting U.S. defense technology, specifically looking at semi-autonomous weapons? And also taking into consideration the different ethical limitations from the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and current DoD policy. And the second part of my question is, at what point, if at all, do you see or foresee artificial intelligence extending into the fully autonomous domain, given that some of our adversaries may not be as limited regard to ethical concerns?
So I think we're back to the discussion of, is it 5 years or is it 50 years or is it 100 years? I think the capacity to build and field an autonomous or semi-autonomous system that has lethal capabilities that require no human intervention is here today. We could do it, but it doesn't scale well in the battle space that we're talking about, the complex battle spaces that we generally would operate in. To your former question on sort of the international controls and how you might implement those, I've actually been an advocate for some kind of convention on how we might use artificial intelligence to create completely automated systems. I think we have to navigate that space very, very carefully, because I'm not sure even if we had the convention, it would be enforceable. We're self-limiting in some space right now with semi-autonomous systems that have human intervention. We call them UASs, but we refuse to sell them to some countries because we believe that it might be in contravention of the missile technology control regime to which we are a signatory. And so what happens is we have allies and partners that say, we'd like to buy the MQ-1 and the MQ-9, and we say, no, we're really sorry, we can't sell that to you. We can't allow you to incorporate it into your military, so where do they go? They go to the Russians and the Chinese, who are more than willing to sell, or they go to the French or the Israelis, who are more than willing to sell that same technology. And so what we end up with is an ally or a partner that's asked us for our help, and in the absence of our help, they go get it from somebody else who will willingly sell the technology, and what they buy is not interoperable with any of the systems that we have in our inventory. So we now have an ally that has systems that are not interoperable with our own. And I think that's a liability. So I think we have to address both sides of that equation.
Hi, I'm Brian Norville. I'm a student in the Hacking for Defense class. The government is traditionally known to be slow and bureaucratic. How do you compete with the private sector to acquire top technology talent?
So let me take a shot at that. I think it's interesting. You're right. Industry can generally pay much more than government can, but government has all kinds of interesting sets of problems and systems that industry does not. I worked at NASA when I was younger, and as I said, I didn't think about it as something that's a permanent career, but I could do things that industry at the time did not have any access to. And so the kinds of problems, the kind of systems that the government has, I think have a certain appeal. The challenge, this may be a subpart of your subtext to your question, is how do you get people to go into security and space, into the government for a permanent career? And I think that is something that we really should think about, because I think this ability to go in and out of government and be able to actually not have it be a permanent job for people. That is normal in Silicon Valley. It's normal in the tech sector that people don't work for the same company for a lifetime. Why should that be the norm in government? Why should that be the norm in this space? The board has had some recommendations in this area to make that energy barrier lower. So for example, having a computer science track, much like there is a medical or legal track in the military, to make that process easier and build deep professional talent that's there for a while. You can do some things that improve that.
So we did that with the stand-up of the directorate that I lead, and we have digital skills communities where they're dedicated to the deep expertise and networks and software development. But even there, we have to look at how do we have a more permeable membrane so that we can promote the interchange between. And it's hard for us because we spend a great deal of money to do the background investigations and the security checks because we entrust these individuals with really exquisite secrets, and we have to trust them to safeguard those secrets. So doing that in a way that's affordable is a challenge for us. But I think from the standpoint of maintaining that talent edge, we have to find a way to do that.
And you also bring in people who will be unhappy with dealing with nonsense, right? You're going to bring folks in who will not put up with, why do I only have 500 megabyte limit on my inbox? Like, what are you talking about, right? So there's a certain level of tension that bringing folks in like that, I think will bring, that I think is quite healthy.
I think there is a place where we have to put a limit on the permeability of the organization, and that's the people who actually inflict violence on an opponent. And so people who wear the uniform, generally. And so the conversation tends to get split in the Defense Department between how do we bring in, innovative young software engineers and innovators, and that's all really cool, and I'm all for that. Then we have a conversation about permeability. How do we bring that engineer in as a cyber operator who's going to have authorities to inflict violence on an enemy through cyberspace? That's a different person who grows up with a different skill set than your normal computer programmer, than your normal code writer. And the ethics and the leadership that they have to learn to be able to lead young men and women that do that task is different. And so I think we have to be careful when we talked about the uniformed services and the permeability of bringing innovation in at different ranks, and the leader development models that we have to help our officers and staff NCOs and senior non-commissioned officers exercise the discipline of inflicting violence on an enemy. And as long as we don't confuse the two, we'll be in good shape. But what I've seen over the course of the last several years is this sort of cloud that descends upon the whole of the institution, and it says we should be permeable at all levels. I'm not sure that's true. In certain tracks, absolutely. Sure. But I think as national security professionals, which many of you will be, you have to be able to draw those distinctions, because what you ask of people who wear the uniform of the nation is different than the civilian employees who inhabit the ecosystem within which we operate. And there's a stark difference there.
But the folks who are military, who retire, who leave, making and go into the tech sector, go into industry, I think we don't take enough advantage of them, because they're already part of that culture, and we want to make sure that they can continue to contribute, even maybe in a reserve capability or other capabilities in the technology realm. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there.
Some agencies, I was going to mention, some agencies have started programs. We have one at DHS where we are trying to leverage that knowledge and that talent by creating exchange programs where people can come in for like a year of time to serve in the government and work with us on certain programs, and then they go back to their regular jobs. So there are agencies trying to leverage that knowledge and that talent out there at all levels of government, and we're seeing some of that.
I am afraid that we are over time. You heard the bells ring. We only have the room till 8. And they charge Dave a lot more money after this. Would you all please thank our panelists, Erin, Simpson, Andrew Hallman, Milo, Medin, General Paul Selva, and Soraya, Correa for all of this. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. We'll see you in class. Can we mute the mics, please? Thanks.